Welcome to the 100th episode of Have We Got Planning News for You? Can you believe that? I never thought I'd live to see 100. We haven't got a telegram from the King yet. Maybe it's in the post. Can I start by the usual reminders? Please, can you consider making a charity donation in lieu of registration fee? We support, as you well know, a range of charities, including Shelter for the housing crisis, a cause well known to Rob and others, and Brian May's Save Me, Ukraine, Just Giving page, and many others on our website. And can we start by welcoming back to the show, by popular demand, our most popular guest ever, Rob Rinder MBE.
Hi, planning crew. How are you?
How are you? Lovely to see you. Can you believe it's been nearly 4 years, three and something years since you last came on the show.
Time has disappeared since I spent my time. Wow.
Hasn't time flown. Anyway, we're so pleased you're back on the show. We can't wait to hear about all your travels, the many places, incredible places you've been to. Most recently was Venice, Rome, Florence on the Grand Tour, Ukraine, Polish border, the Middle East and everything. So, and your thoughts on the housing crisis, putting the world to rights, etc. So we'll have a great chats with you in the second half of the show. As I said to you last time in November, Rob, and I will say again, I say to all our guests in the first half of the show, is there anything you want to say or jump in and join the chat, as I remember you did last time with a famous quote of yours, famous for us at least, which we're going to remind our viewers of in a moment. I'm going to introduce the rest of the team first, and then we're going to do a little bit of brief reminiscing. But first up, as always, Mary.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Rob. It's lovely to see you again. Mary Cook, Town Legal, sitting in the offices in the city in London, and can't believe we've done 100 shows. Amazing.
Incredible. Sasha?
Hi, Charlie. I'm very well. I'm in North London. I'm in the delights of Hampstead Garden suburb. And as Mary says, I remember like yesterday you phoning me to discuss the idea in your fertile and brilliant mind coming up with this wonderful idea.
I was drunk on a Friday evening. I thought, this was a really good idea.
Yeah, well, Chris and Mary were out and I was the only one who answered.
Great to see you, Sasha, and your brand new Peloton, never knowingly used, I'm sure. It's just there for decoration. Lovely to see you, Paul. You look like you're in a theatre.
I'm not in a theatre. I'm in Judge
the judge's doing it. It's in Rob's courtroom.
I've got a glass of champagne to celebrate. Court. So it's a joy to see you, Rob. So cheers to everybody. 100 shows, right?
Congratulations.
And Chris, how the devil are you?
I'm very well, Charlie. Nice to see you. Yeah, I think it's important, actually, we acknowledge it. It was originally your idea. I got rung up on the same evening, Sasha. He was even more drunk when he rang me up and said, why don't we all have a drink while we're doing the show? And like for members of the bar to be having a drink whilst doing a webinar just seemed like completely alien, didn't it? And yeah, genius, Charlie, just genius. I am in our chambers in global headquarters here in Birmingham, 7 floors up. Before we get going, I just want to thank you, Rob, for something that you don't really know about, which is that when you came on the show last time, I asked if you, as an ambassador for Shelter, would endorse me running for Shelter in the London Marathon. And that helped because I got one of the places, and this is me running it dressed as a house. And I've done that twice. I thought I'd do something a bit funny. I've done that twice and it's raised £49,000. Wow. We work in a very generous industry. So thank you very much. You gave me that opportunity. They asked me to run it again. I couldn't say no, and it's all down to you. Thank you.
Bravo. Yeah. Bravo, Rob. Bravo. Before we start the rest, we're going to spend a minute or two recapping on our favourite moments of our 100 episodes so far. And Rob, be warned, you feature on this. So we're going to start, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed the tech works, which we may well not do knowing this show. But we're going to start with Sasha, your favourite moment of the show.
It is with incredible pleasure that we welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to speak to you about Coming Home, the Church of England's report on tackling the housing crisis, launched this week. It was commissioned in 2019 by yourself and the Archbishop of York. The commission is independent of the Church of England's institutions, with complete freedom to say whatever it thinks and believes is necessary. And this report is certainly that.
What a special moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury, incredible.
Absolutely extraordinary. And from the sublime to the ridiculous, Paul, your favourite moment.
Yeah, your hair. Well done, it.
Good afternoon, Charlie. I tell you, it's going to be very difficult not to really laugh because your hair is taking off from time to time, and it reminds me of a mad professor. And it's quite entertaining. It's quite entertaining.
Well, I'm thinking it's not a wig. Somebody's already said in the chat, and covers a surprise. No, I've got a few. On that note, Paul, how are you with your Hackney carriage?
It's not Mad Professor time, Charlie. It's Donald Trump coming down the
Oh, that's below the belt. Oh, dear. It is real. I promise you. Chris, from one well-haired individual to another.
Brian May, goodness, remember this? What I'd really like to ask you is, what is Bohemian Rhapsody all about? But I know we're not supposed to use that for that. Although I've got a sneaky suspicion that Galileo might be a reference to you, might it?
I know exactly what it's about, but I'd have to kill you.
I have to kill you first.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who would want that. But
Go on, Chris, take a hit to the team.
yeah, I'll do that.
And lastly, my favourite episode, to bring us full circle, and back to Rob. Now, onto our special guest discussion with Rob. And so Rob, firstly, just tell us a little bit more about your new role with Shells. What was involved? How did it come to be? How did you get involved?
Well, firstly, I have to say, when you invited me onto a planning podcast, I can't lie, I thought after the first 4 minutes, I'd gently slip into a coma. But I certainly didn't think that I'd be thinking to myself, bloody hell, I actually want to tune in next week. Oh, it's sort of interesting and sexy. And genuinely fun. It's sort of like, sort of Melvin Bragg, but sort of without any of the sort of boring bits. This is fantastic.
You might find that we just copy that bit of video you just did.
Best sexy law secret there is. I'm not sure. Normally the collective noun of a group of lawyers, I'm not quite sure, would be a malice. So, I'm listening to Chris and Mary going, well, okay, but what happened next? And what did they build? There's a program here. I want to see the end result of that hotel, and then I'm not sure I want to know what's happened, what horror happens on that Greenfield site. But I'm pleased that you're part of destroying it, Chris. So well done, you.
Is our planning still sexy? 4 years on.
He hasn't heard the show yet.
Man,
like a fine wine. You seem to be getting better with age. It's unusual.
I have to say, Rob, you are the person that everybody asks us about. You brought your television magic to our little podcast, and you just blew us away, basically. Just amazing.
Really, I'm quite surprised by where I find people listening to this. The other night, I was in a pub with my brother and his friends, and I said, what are you up to? Why can't you do this thing on Thursday night? Well, I'm hanging out with a bunch of planning lawyers. And again, it doesn't immediately sort of scream ratings. And then neither did sort of Sister Wendy in front of Great Art. And it turns out that he's a mega fan.
No.
Yeah. Hi, Gavin Sherman, if you're listening. Yeah.
Wonderful. Oh, wonderful. So thank you so much, Rob, for providing our initial dose of rocket fuel. And we're so pleased to have you back. Right, well, let's go on with our case updates.
Hang on, my favourite. What about my favourite?
Sorry, I do apologise, Mary. How terrible. There's always going to be one cock up.
Is that in celebration of our 100th anniversary, you've got to have one anniversary cock up?
Absolutely, at least. And it's actually the funniest moment of the whole show, probably. So, Mary,
no, cut this bit. Cut this bit.
It's quality.
And I would like to have an Oscar awarded to me this evening for keeping a straight face whilst delivering that summary in what can only be described as adversity, because I've got Paul Tucker looming at me, and I've got Chris
giggling his head off, and it's absolutely it's ridiculous.
I'm so sorry, but the reason is that the chat, the Q&A, people are talking about Paul thinking is in Bohemian Rhapsody of Wayne's World, and it is
Duncan, can I just apologise now for the riffraff that's going on here?
The comments, I've had to obscure Paul's I've had to obscure Paul's face with a post-it note because I just lost it. People are saying, what are they? Has Paul been kicked out of the family home? Has Paul been kidnapped? We could just sit here and watch Paul swaying on the screen. Is Paul in a taxi home after a big night out? I think Paul's in a bad way, and that was a cry for help. Is Paul striving to pick Charlie up? Someone put Paul in the boot. Oh dear, we could go on all night. What you missed for that clip is that Paul had been in a taxi for about 20 minutes up to that clip, lying down for most of it, and so I had to go off screen and got the giggles. Great fun, and Mary, as always, keeping us all in order.
Thank you.
Good. Right, now news. Chris, tell us the news.
I am going to tell you
nothing's going on this week, of course.
This is a little 5-minute segment we introduced, Rob, where we just review the latest news. And what would I talk about other than, of course, the party manifestos? We've had all of those this week, and if we got no time to effectively go through them all and all of the things that they're dealing with, but I'm just going to focus on housing. Imagine that. And what we discover is that the Labour Party is suggesting they'll build 1.5 million homes, that's 300,000 a year, during the next Parliament. The Conservatives have come in at 1.6 million, so that's 320,000 a year. And the Liberal Democrats have come in at 1.9 million, which is 380,000 a year. So those are the figures that are being offered from the three main parties. I think the question everybody's asking is, how do they get to those figures? How are they going to deliver them? Well, first of all, we got the Conservatives, and they want to scrap neutrality. They want to do away with unmeritorious judicial review challenges, and they want to see more housing in cities. They've already got a 35% uplift, so I guess it'd be a 45% uplift or something like that. But obviously, as everybody's saying, what is their track record? And that is the difficulty if you're the government, isn't it? What is, you get judged by your current performance. And of course, 2010 to 2020 was the lowest decade of house building since the Second World War. Got a bit better from 2018 onwards, but they've never reached the 300,000. So people are sort of scratching their heads and raising an eyebrow about how are you going to get to 320,000 a year when you didn't get to 300,000, and now you've introduced a series of reforms to abandon housing targets and so on. Liberal Democrats, they've got the highest figure, but of course, as we all know, the leadership wanted 150,000 a year instead of 380,000 a year. They were stopped by the young Liberal Democrats with their T-shirts at the party conference saying, just build the bloody houses. So we know the leadership aren't really focused on a high figure. And as many of us know, many Liberal Democrats have come into councils in the Blue Wall and sought to reduce the housing requirements. So again, quite difficult to see how they're going to achieve that. And then finally, Labour, they issued their manifesto today. They want to reintroduce housing targets. They want to reverse the changes the government brought in the end of last year to abandon housing targets, and they want to do that immediately, they say, and they want to restore strategic planning, have a new generation of new towns, and they want to reform compulsory purchase. So I think the question for us, at least as professionals, is who's got the most credible plan? But that's a matter for the voters. That's a summary of the three parties' manifestos.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. Now, that clip from the Archbishop of Canterbury that we played earlier was to launch the Church's report Coming Home into how the Church could play its role in dealing with the housing crisis. And one of the things it suggested was using church land that maybe the Church may be sitting on that could be used to release the land for housing. And one such proposal was next to Guildford Cathedral, which the church, in combination with Vivid Housing, sought planning permission. And Sasha, you're going to tell us how that went.
Well, yeah, I am. I'm going to take you to the glorious spot in Guildford, which is effectively the precinct of the Guildford Cathedral, which the more educated will know. So I'll have to tell Paul this for the first time. But the Guildford Cathedral was actually recently built, i.e. post the Second World War, by Sir Basil Spence between 1951 and 1962. And those that know it will know that it's got a very nice setting and it's got significant grounds around it. Now, this is an interesting appeal because what the cathedral wanted to do, as you can see, is they sought permission to demolish various houses in the cathedral close and erect 124 new houses, including affordable housing. And it's interesting, this case, because there was a degree of an allocation in the development plan. I speak with a bit of pain because I spent 4 weeks in 2021 trying to get an allocated site planning permission, and that failed on the rock of heritage concerns. And I'm afraid the cathedral felt exactly the same way. Their appeal was dismissed, and it was dismissed on effectively the view that there was harm to various heritage assets, of course, and there was also the view, of course, the wrestling with the public benefits. And the inspector took quite an interesting approach for two reasons. The first is he took the view, effectively, that, as we all know, and probably all the five of us have always wrestled this, whenever you get a heritage case or someone like Guildford Cathedral seeking to raise funds, there's always the debate at the highest end of the spectrum. You can put a full enabling case, and then below that is various degrees of need. And in this case, Guildford Cathedral were very clear they were not arguing an enabling case, but they were arguing a case that with the funds raised from the housing, effectively it would assist their viability and long-term security. So it was somewhere lesser than an enabling case, but it seems that the inspector wasn't particularly satisfied about the level of development proposed and how that could tie in. And I think for all our practitioners, it's really interesting about how difficult it is to pitch the case when you're seeking effectively to cause heritage harm, and when the fundamental element that justifies it is some form of financial case. And I certainly know from my own practice, it is a really difficult area to get right. And I have a lot of sympathy with the appellants in this case who decided not to have an enabling case, but basically they are not surprisingly said that the funds that would be raised would make a significant difference to their finances long term. But the inspector was not convinced by that argument, and he also wasn't convinced, and this again, it seems slightly harsh, but he wasn't convinced that similar benefits could not be achieved in other ways, which of course is quite a high hurdle to satisfy. So overall, in the wrestling with the 208 balance, the inspector came to the view that, frankly, the public benefits did not outweigh the harm, and unfortunately planning permission was refused. But I think for anybody who's involved in a heritage case, particularly with a financial element, whether it be enabling or just to assist those that own the heritage asset, it's a very, very interesting case that shows how this is approached by inspectors in the context of a Section 78. So thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Sasha. Now, next up, we have an appeal by Carla at Warwickshire Police Headquarters. So our resident good cop, or is he a bad cop? Paul is going to tell us about that.
How is it I'm getting the abuse this afternoon? Right. So I'm going to tell you about an appeal by Carla Holmes in Warwick, within the grounds of a place called Woodcote Hall, which is the headquarters of the Warwickshire Police. It's an allocated site, allocated for 115 houses, and Carla sought permission for 83 houses for outline consent, which was not determined for a long time by Warwickshire District Council. Once Carla had appealed, Warwickshire put to their members what they might do with the application, and decided they would have refused it on the grounds of highways, heritage, biodiversity, drainage, anything else they could have thought of. However, It was put back to them a second time, and they decided that it was only on heritage that they were going to defend the decision. They also decided on the first day of the inquiry to produce a new 5-year housing land supply assessment, which surprisingly enough resulted in an adjournment of the whole inquiry and resulted in adverse cost decisions against them in favour of the appellants and the Rule 6 party. There was also a Wheatcroft application. There was a new net zero DPD that came out. Everything exciting was happening. Well, the appeal was ultimately allowed. And it's an interesting case, not because of the procedural chaos that was taking place, but because of the way in which the policies were being assessed. So the assessment was, in the plan, that any consent on the allocation would have to not simply deliver housing, but would also have to deliver an enhancement and future use of Woodcote Hall and the outhouses around Woodcote Hall, which was Grade 2 listed. Because the police decided since 2018, when the local plan was adopted, that they were not leaving that utterly beautiful location and they were going to carry on there. The other side of it is a really tatty 1960s, I think it is, extension. But the police said, we're not leaving. So there was no opportunity for Carla to be able to enhance or do anything with the hall because the police are using it. So the case that was run against them by the council was, there's heritage harm and you're not enhancing and providing any future use of the hall. The inspector, Mr. Inspector Lee, had absolutely no truck with that and said, well, I'm terribly sorry. It's an allocated site. And whilst there is a breach of policy as a result of not delivering enhancements to the hall, that's not harm. That's a failure to deliver a benefit. And in those circumstances, even though there was a 5-year land supply, the benefits of delivering an allocated site outweighed any minor heritage harm which arose. There was lots of complaints about poor custodianship of the hall by the police, particularly by the Rule 6 party, but none of that was considered material by the inspector. It's all in all a bit of a sorry tale of a site which should have been granted consent on the basis it's an allocated site. So another instance of the planning system not working properly. By the way, where is Guildford, Sasha?
From Warwickshire to Wisley. And Mary, you're going to tell us about the fruits of a very lengthy inquiry that took place towards the end of last year.
Indeed, against Guildford Borough Council, by coincidence. So this is an appeal against non-determination of a hybrid application on an allocated site, very important, allocated site, for highway works, SANG, and as you can see, outline planning permission for some 1,730 homes on the former Wisley Airfield site. At the time this appeal against non-determination was lodged, there were outstanding objections from Natural England, Natural Highways, Surrey County Councillors, the Highway Authority and the Environment Agency. And there were putative reasons for refusal, which came to be identified relating really to SANG, BNG, highways, and the usual lack of a 106 obligation. The appellant submitted a considerable amount of further information shortly before the pre-inquiry meeting. That information was all admitted by Christina Downs, the inspector. She allowed all the parties to make representations in relation to the new material. There were some tweaks to various parameter plans. She had 4 opposing Rule 6 parties in front of her and 2 supporting Rule 6 parties, although the supporters, one of whom was represented by none other than our own Paul Tucker, didn't call any live evidence. So most of the application site in front of her was part of this allocated site. Not quite all of the allocated site was in the red line in front of her, but because provision had been made for links to the other land, she didn't have any main issue about that. It seems that at this inquiry, which, by the way, sat for 32 days, the report and the cost decisions extended to 170 pages. So I had lots of homework this week. But one of the things she had to grapple with was the point that the Rule 6 parties were seeking to challenge the principle of development. This had been a site which had been the subject of a Section 78 appeal some years before, which hadn't been successful only on because of highway issues. It then got allocated in the Guildford plan. And she said because of the allocation, it wasn't appropriate for her to address the principle of development on the site. She was only interested in whether the requirements of the development plan policy A35, which was the allocation policy, were met. And to those local residents who prayed in aid policy E5, which sought to protect protect the loss of agricultural land, she said it was inevitable that there'd be a loss of agricultural land in order for policy A35 to come to pass, so as it were. So she said that there were always policies that pull in different directions, and how right that remark is. And I think that's actually something that sometimes gets forgotten. But she was very clear in her mind that although some of the elements of the criteria in policy A35 hadn't been complied with, there was good reason for that. There was an awful lot of highways evidence in this case. And so she came to the conclusion that overall it complied with the development plan, and she granted consent. Interestingly, she made a number of costs awards. She made a partial award against Taylor Wimpey, who were the appellant, on the basis of a modelling error that their transport consultants had made, which wasn't addressed until shortly before cross-examination at the inquiry. And she found that the objectors had been put to a lot of unnecessary expense as a result of this error, and so they were successful in getting an award on that basis. But she also made awards of costs against the Rule 6 parties because of their unreasonable behaviour, because some of their evidence attacked the principle. She thought that the highway evidence, some of their highway evidence, which related to the difference between the transport assessment and the environmental statement, was unreasonable. And she also thought that some of the ecology evidence and some of the issues that were raised there about surveys was also unreasonable. So it just goes to show that you shouldn't be raising points of principle on allocated sites at inquiry. And if you do, you run the risk of incurring costs awards against yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. Lesson well learned. Rob, now time for our discussion with you. I'm going to kick it off, and then we're going to all ask you a few questions. As I said before, it's November 2020 was when you came on the show, just before you released My Family, the Holocaust and Me, that wonderful, moving series. You received MBE in 2020, along with your mum, wasn't it, for Holocaust Education Awareness. Since then, you've presented The Holy Land in Us, exploring the personal stories of both Jewish and Palestinian heritage. Series such as Interrogation Secrets, Amazing Hotels, and mostly recently the Grand Tour with Rylan. As I said, Venice, Florence, Rome, not to mention travelling to the Polish-Ukraine border to report on this crisis for talk radio, something close to my heart, as you well know, Rob, with my Ukrainian connection. Even interviewed one of my Ukrainian friends on the front line, if you remember, which was quite big. Well, so, I mean, you're an extremely well-travelled person to all sorts of places of great culture and great difficulty. Any standout memories or lessons from your various travels, those I've mentioned and any others?
Well, the memories and lessons are probably different from each other. But firstly, congratulations on 100 shows. And the reason I'm a bit bamboozled and not asking the questions, because, I'm going to say it again, I got completely into that news. And, as I said to you earlier, it doesn't necessarily scream, populism, a group of planning lawyers getting together and chatting about what the latest legal developments are. But I'm sitting here completely intrigued by it. And it's not just because I'm a legal geek, and I do go to sleep every night listening to American Supreme Court cases, largely because they're contained in 1 hour. Whereas mostly if you watch Supreme Court cases here, all you really hear is, where is that in the bundle? So they're high stylistic. But it's really fantastic, and it demonstrates how great lawyers in this country are at kind of empowering people who are not sort of involved or at the coalface of the world to sort of understand what's happening. So, that's really great. I'm definitely not going to challenge the principle if I'm ever in a situation like that, because there are cost of it. I mean, it's extraordinary. I want to know what happened. So where did I learn most? And, what's been perhaps a different experience? I mean, you mentioned two things there. One was this extraordinary, I guess privilege is the word. It's overused, but I think sometimes it matters to be present at Shemshil railway station in that, again, moment when over days, women and children were coming over the border. And it's such an extraordinary thing. And it connects to the other program that you were referring to, the Holocaust, My Family and Me, that, I suspect you might have been there, either Medica or Shemshil railway station. And less than a week before, that had been an ordinary road. Certainly the train station at Przemyśl in Poland was better, certainly than a lot of the railway stations we have. And the motorway from Medica into Ukraine from Poland was infinitely nicer than lots of bits of RM1 and RM6, pick a row. And it's surrounded by all these outward vestiges of modernity, great big McDonald's, and in the blink of a historical eye, that place had been turned into a refugee centre. And I was standing there and people were coming in from trains, usually from eastern Ukraine, cheek to jowl, mums with babies. And it's that thing, that sort of conversation that you have with them. One occasion, I was speaking to a woman, I'm enough of a Russian speaker, and she said she'd stayed as long as she could until they started bombing the nursery schools. And then as she was walking away, her husband had a story that, he'd been standing in and the Russian that we have in Chlebna, a bread line, and immediately kind of evokes developments of post-Soviet or Soviet Russia, places of kind of, utilitarian lung butter yellow. And actually, I said, well, what happened? I was standing in this bread line, and a drone came and killed my neighbour and my nephew. And that was outside an Aldi in that part of the world. And it's that thing, that sense of being confronted by modernity, the outward vestiges of the things that we have here, that makes us think that we're safe and cushioned from barbarity. And that was a really arresting moment that, is a useful way of perhaps thinking about our privilege and how we need, regardless of your political point of view, never to be complacent in this sacred thing called democracy. And again, that was really drawn into the sharpest emotional focus in the program you would have seen, being in the grounds of Treblinka.
Yeah.
With the last living eyewitness, who I didn't know I was going to meet until only half an hour before. And it wasn't, so he decided he wanted to go back and be alongside me, not because he'd seen me, but because he'd seen my mum on my Who Do You Think You Are? And so to stand alongside him as we were making the Jewish memorial prayer, and as I was about to exclaim the names of my relatives, my mum's uncles and aunts, uncles and aunts, the youngest was 7 years old, and say that prayer, it's called the Kaddish, really to breathe life back into them, let's say, to give them the respect that they were denied. He touched my shoulder and said, no, this is for all the living people in the world. So, that's an amazing gift to be able to share with people. And now I'm really delighted to say that the program has been turned into an educational experience, which is now taught in 300 schools up and down the country with UCL. It's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And every school of every, every complexion, religious schools, again, from every background, every faith community. So when people say that we are a divided country, which undoubtedly we are, and there are complexities and nuance, which undoubtedly there is, nevertheless, there is a shared thirst from young learners and teachers across the country to remind people just how sacred our freedoms are. And that's been really great. In terms of take it back into the shallow end, which is mostly where I spend my time. But in addition to, by the way, making notes, as you were talking, I have to say, it was Chris, wasn't it, that gave us the summary of the party manifestos?
Yes.
But fantastic, Chris. Well done for raising £49,000 for shelter. Thank you so much. But also, your summary is really good. And I'm doing Good Morning Britain tomorrow. I'm nicking that. It's
I'm going to be putting it to a politician. Yeah, thanks. But one of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing nowadays, because I present amazing hotels, is looking at development in various parts of the world. And, kind of what makes a great hotel and how they go about building it from kind of beginning to delivering at the kind of highest end. And so much of it is about all the things that you talk about here, which is why planning law, and I'm going to say it again, listeners, is so sexy, because it includes absolutely everything, right? I mean, it's sort of basic stuff. You're dealing with builders. I mean, that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I mean, that's my dream. If I couldn't have been a lawyer, I'd have been a useless scaffolder. But it's also local politics and sustainability and, long-term planning and visitor experience and so forth. It has the kind of full buffet of human life and art, of course, as well. I say, of course, and it's been so fascinating learning about how different planning processes take place across the world, some better than others. But what's been really interesting, and I don't know the extent to which it applies here, is that what I've noticed is whichever country I'm in, that issues, let's say, about sustainability and how the long-term imprint of a hotel, or how that's going to survive in a serious way, is a really important aspect of planning and planners. And it seems to be, one of the few, let's say, green policies that's travelled well across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how we quite a few have stayed in hotels probably more nights per year than we stay at home, to be quite honest. And you become, you notice little details about the ecosystems. I want to take you back into depth from the shallows for a moment, Robert. Something a theme that we've looked at on this show over the years, more and more actually, is how to try and get rid of some of the toxicity in planning. There's a lot of both the national debate and also locally at individual inquiries. You get, in particular campaigns, a lot of toxicity in all sorts of ways. And you said, though I know you well, I was doing my research as you'd expect me to do, and it struck me. I saw that back in October you said that publicly that your Jewish family didn't feel at the time, at least, safe in the UK amidst the Israeli-Gaza conflict. That struck a note with me, because without saying who, I'm aware of Jewish developers who are now so fearful of recriminations from a combination of the sort of usual toxicity of planning, alongside what some would call anti-Israel sentiment and others might call naked anti-Semitism, that they're actually looking and taking legal advice on what can be done to obscure their identity so that people can't tell the applicant is Jewish. And I must say, I never thought that I'd have to advise in 2024 on how to obscure someone's religion in this country in the context of a planning process. And how can we go? You're somebody who's very positive character, spreading love and goodwill. How do we get rid of the hate and division that pervades at least some of our public discourse? And I appreciate there's a lot of good out there too, but there's obviously at least a lot of division.
Well, there's two questions. First of all, that's a really important and horrifying example. So when, you'll hear people say, well, what are you talking about anti-Semitism and people being fearful? I now have an example from this encounter where I can say there are planners out there who are so terrified of being exposed, just about that word, into 2024 as Jewish, because of the impact that will have on their planning application, where they're very likely to be applying to do build housing, or do good for their community of people of every faith. The answer is, look, I'm certainly not, I don't have the answer to that question, but there are two elements that are certainly true. One, I can't remember who it was. I think it was a filmmaker, I don't remember who said, tyranny is a deliberate removal of nuance. And you referred to the film I made with BBC and other colleagues. It took 3 years to make, called The Holy Land. And it tells a story of the origin stories of the State of Israel, but also the number of tragedies, including the first time ever that the Nakba was explored, talked about, and experienced, let's say, on the BBC. And I didn't think that it was going to change anybody's mind. It certainly self-evidently didn't. But what it does do is empower people to walk away and go, goodness me, that's complicated, that's nuanced. That's a starting point. And the second thing is that, we could talk about social media, there's two elements of that. But the first one is, regardless of your political complexion, enabling people to understand that we disagree with one another, but we attack ideas and not people, and doing everything we can across those platforms to show that now more than ever is extremely important. And so how do we go about doing that in the context of a world where social media is so radically influenced and shapes public opinion? It certainly has a disproportionate power to curate the political and cultural narrative in a way which is radically disproportionate from the number of people on Twitter. There's 12 of them, and they're angry, right? And it's one thing is sort of acknowledging how that space works. The first thing is how people feel about certain things who are sort of angry in that space sits in the emotional hemisphere of their brain and where their identity is. You're not going to change their mind by being lawyers or deploying sort of thoughtful points. That just doesn't land. There are three elements to a point which I think sometimes troubles lawyers because it's just not what you do. The first one is to say, look, I hear you. Difficult work, but actually meaning it and listening, active listening. Secondly, to deploy the facts because they're important and they don't care very much about your feelings. But again, that will bounce off. But the best way is the third element, which is what you've just gifted me here, is to say, well, let me tell you a story. So I hear you that you say that there's not much anti-Semitism and it, doesn't affect people's lives and people aren't living in fear. And the facts are that actually you're probably right in this regard, that we have an independent, robust, really good quality judiciary in this country. And that does protect people from, in all seriousness, in all likelihood, them being affected by anti-Semitism in the course of their application. But let me tell you how a Jewish person feels. I know a planning lawyer who told me that they masked their names in order to avoid being identified as Jewish. So we need to think about nowadays how we change and shape the points that we make. And that's part of doing it. But, small things like we may radically disagree with one another, taking a photo, I disagree with this man. He's not my kind of political cup of tea, but he's a really good bloke. Those sorts of things. Yeah. And I think sort of taking the heat out of the discourse is part of it.
Persuasion and argument are two different things. And that's all something but lost. Mary, you've got to have a couple of questions, no doubt, for Rob. Over to you.
I do, Rob. My question to start with is a little more lighthearted.
Okay.
All the anguish that you and Charlie have been talking about, I like to think that actually as a country we are more united than we are divided, and we need to remember that. But I wanted to ask you about your reflections in your role either as a barrister or in your role as Judge Rinder on TV. And I wanted to ask you to recount to us one of your most memorable moments.
Well, firstly, I'm going to say I agree with you. I think we are more of a nation of harmony than discord.
Yes.
And you see all that. I see it all the time. I mean, like I say, tomorrow I'll do GMB, and if somebody's up at 6 o'clock in the morning, says Rob Rinder's great. He or she may be up all night chain smoking parliaments and wearing a moo, but nevertheless, the story in the Star, which we pick up by the other red tops, will be Rob Rinder, greatest presenter ever, clambering, everybody sort of screaming that he should have the seat for every day of the week. So it's that's I think sowing more discord than is actually a reflection of what's going on. And I know from politicians across the political spectrum that the difference between perception and what's actually happening on doorsteps is a really good indication of that. We're actually, and I think there are going to be a number of surprises come election day as well. Judge Rinder, so many, but I will tell you what's really interesting is why I like tuning into this time. I suspect it's the same for you. People say, what's your favourite kind of planning application or case? Often it's the small ones. And often there's the small ones that are kind of the most challenging and difficult. People say, well, Judge Rinder, sometimes they roll their eyes and say, well, it's a bit like pantomime or theatre. And you have to remind them, well, think about this case. So the 1930s, a woman's pouring out a bottle of ginger beer to her mate, and there's a masticated snail that comes out, she passes out. Right. That meanders itself to the Court of Appeal and then eventually to the then House of Lords. And Lord Adkins stands up. Who is my neighbour, right? Sort of fundamental basis for duty of care, etc. That's the law, Donahue and Stevenson, of not just our country, but there'll be some lawyer somewhere in Pakistan or New Zealand or Australia and Canada who's quoting that case. It's always the small cases that have the sort of craziest or most challenging facts that are the most fun. My favourite probably was a case where it was they had a band who were a busking group in Manchester, and they were going to take part in Battle of the Bands. And as you know, they take their pop music very seriously in that part of the world. And 3 players, who are super good, and a 75-year-old and an 83-year-old street dancer, and they would get the crowds in. Now, I'm not sure, it's not my bag, but Bez from the Happy Mondays, think that. And the 75-year-old enters them into Battle of the Bands. Paul, I think, is asked, where is Manchester? It's north of the Watford Gap. In comes, what they do, they enter, the 75-year-old enters, he's managing them, enters them to the Manchester Battle of the Bands. It's a £5,000 prize. It's a lot of money for anybody, but it's certainly for this group. And they get to the final. And the rest of the group, without telling the 75-year-old manager, who takes it extremely seriously, they decide they're going to do a stunt, which is going to get them over the finish line. They persuade the 83-year-old, who's at the sort of beginning stages of dementia, that what he should do is put on a lime green mankini and come out and dance. And that's just going to get the crowd going. Only it was very dark. They get to the final, as I say, and he has a wardrobe malfunction. So the 75-year-old's out on the stage dancing to this wave of hysteria, and the bit that's supposed to be covering his manhood ends up on his head, and the band are disqualified. Right. And so the 75-year-old brings a deadly serious case. He gets loss of opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Breach of contract. And it was a really interesting case. And again, sort of trying to communicate why he might be entitled to some damages there, but also tried to kind of establish what evidence he would need in order to prove his case. Again, that's it was a really fun case, but at the heart of it, that's sort of really challenging law. And I think those cases which had art, humour, and a fair degree of legal takeaway were the ones that I remember most fondly.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Now, so on to somebody else who likes to dance in a mankini. Paul.
This really is having a go all night tonight. I cannot believe that on our podcast that you've attributed, Rob, Paul, where is Manchester, to me. My whole profile.
I'm sorry.
Is in Manchester.
He is Manchester.
I am. Manchester. Sorry. I got confused with the whole thing. I'm sorry. Technology. Actually, there's probably, it's probably libel, I think.
Paul has sometimes got it wrong about which county it is.
Yeah, it's actually
it was relatively ground.
Never. Up until there, Rob, you were high in my estimation. It's just
I blame Chris, Paul. Sorry.
Yeah, I always do. More seriously, Rob. After you came on the show last time, in fact, it was within a week your show, Mike, me, the Holocaust, and I was on. Hugely moving. And I said in a private message to you why it was that you involved with my paternal grandfather who passed away 30 years ago this week. So just to say publicly, Rob, thank you. An amazing thing you've done. But I'm going to ask you about another show, which is a little more lighthearted than that one, which I've also watched and also loved, which is the Grand Tour show that Charlie mentioned earlier on, where you went around some of the most wonderful locations, did the most amazingly stupid and crazy and entertaining things with Ryland. But one of the things you did was that you stood in front of Caravaggio's Madonna of Loreto, which is an extraordinary painting. And one of the things that was mentioned was, this is beautiful. Well, believe it or not, at the heart of the planning system, thanks to the outgoing government, we have a test of beauty that has to be applied to the built environment. So I'm interested in words. Is there a danger that we debase important words when we misuse them in a more prosaic context? Or should every UK housing estate aim to look like the Piazza del Campo in Siena? What are your thoughts?
I have strong opinions. I don't think it needs to look like that. But certainly architecture matters and human dignity matters. You talk about planning and personal experience. Well, actually, let's come back to Ryland. One of the things that's emerged, and part of the reason we made that work, is because it was about who feels comfortable going into sort of spaces of great art, right? And all you need to be, as we know, is culturally curious and open-minded. But for many people, those feel beyond their fingertips, right? Because our country, especially, whose original sin, let's say, as class, has told them that it's not necessarily for them. And coming back to the specificity of your question, my dad grew up around the corner from where I'm sitting now in Highbury Quadrant. And that's still an estate that really functions and works. And he remembers, as a kid, foreign tourists being shown that place. And you can see in every facet of its design where the parks are, where the squares are, how high it's been built, the materials that have been used, that there has been more than, I'm going to put it higher than that. So many developments are created, and you can see when they've been created, on the quick buck and with undivided indifference. And if your environment around you, where you live, doesn't sing to you, doesn't teach you, doesn't share that you have the limitless capacity for human dignity, which is what architecture and planning and development is, it seems to me we don't just do a disservice, but we do an act of deliberate violence against those communities. So yes, of course, beauty should matter. Now, as to what that means and what the criteria, what criteria should be applied and whose version of beauty that we use, that's a more nuanced and complicated question for you guys. But certainly, should that factor in decisions about planning, bearing in mind the communities who are going to be the happy beneficiaries of these spaces? From my point of view, yes, it's everything.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sasha.
Thank you, Charlie. Rob, I know I've probably got to go through your agent, but I'm going to make you a job off. When you get fed up with entertainment, come back to the bar and you can... There are a lot of late arrivals at the planning bar, so you've got 5 organisations who'd willingly offer you a pupillage.
Oh, that's very sweet.
No, I wanted to ask, that's quite in the... Because we all choose our very specialist areas when we're ridiculously young. Looking back on your career at the bar, and I know you practiced from Harewood Court, would you, in retrospect, would you still have started in that area of law? With the benefit of hindsight, would you have chosen a different area of law to start your legal practice?
No, I've never been asked that question. I'm really, it's the first. Yeah, I would have done. It suited me. But I had a lot of luck. Don't forget, I came to the bar when, I don't want to put it in this way, but it's just a shorthand. The legal aid party, let's say, was still, in full swing. In other words, you could live a very decent life on the type of cases I was doing 4 years in. There was a red corner brief. To give you an example for listeners that may not know, I mean, a case that I had done defending in a fraud as a junior 4 years in, had a bit of luck. The right solicitor saw me at the right lucky time. That case that would be worth, a considerable amount of money that would enable me to do smaller cases the rest of the year. A case that might be worth, say, £50,000. The same case by the time I stopped practicing significantly, with the same number of papers, the same issues, etc. In every aspect of its nuance and complexity the same, was worth about £5,000. That was the difference. Now, luckily, I actually started at 2 paper buildings with Sir Desmond de Silva, who was the then Chief War Crimes Prosecutor in Sierra Leone, and a fascinating character, to say the very least. And like I said, because I had those years where I could live life, albeit with some financial challenge rather, but nevertheless kind of in the black, evolving and building and shaping a practice. I got to do fascinating things very, very quickly, and I liked being a jury advocate at first. So, I mean, the only way of answering that question is by looking around and seeing, my great friends now and the type of work they do, and asking myself a question: do I have the gifts that you have and the talents and the sort of necessary qualities to do them? And seeing my friends who practice in the commercial bar or planning bar, etc., but especially the vast majority of my friends who are still there are either at the criminal bar, but that's my field, but in the commercial bar, I don't think I do. So I think it suited, let's say, my talents best. But I've never really given it any more thought than that, because it's the first time I've been asked that question. Thoughtful way. Certainly by the time I'd finished, I'd fallen very deeply out of love with it. And that's an important thing to understand. I mean, if you go every day and you're fighting for a client in a criminal case, you absolutely have to, I would say even there's a kind of spiritual element to it. You have to believe in the system. And the instant that you fall sort of out of love with it, and bearing in mind our clients, we are servants to our clients to an important extent, that becomes very depleting very quickly. And it certainly did in my case. But yeah, I mean, I eventually ended up being a prosecutor in international cases, and I enjoyed that a lot. And the other thing I would say, it's interesting, and I don't think I've ever discussed this anywhere else, but thinking about Keir Starmer as DPP, we as lawyers sort of understand, I think, what that means. But I think people outside that world don't really get it. It's no shout out to Keir Starmer. I mean, applying as much as I can my impartiality, but there's perhaps a reason why he's less effective as a politician. Some of you will be aware of The Room, which I know this is planning law, but in crime, it's the lawyers who make it to be Treasury Counsel who do the most serious cases. In fact, effectively sign a contract where they'll only do that, or they'll chiefly have that as their practice for a few years. Now, the people who become Treasury Counsels who get into the second floor of the Old Bailey or third floor, it's called The Room. And, when I first started, as a number of you did, there'd always be some duffer who'd end up on the circuit bench, or every year you'd read the silk test and you'd go, really, at least one person, you'd think, well, I'd get out of that person. Which nowadays is definitely less so as it become more independent. But nobody ever got into The Room to become Treasury Counsel who just wasn't the best. And by the best, I mean, the ethical best as well. And what that means and meant was to me is that, people like, let's say, Bobby Chi McGruck is the Queen's Bench Division, now First Asian Woman High Court judge. If she was prosecuting you and said, there is no evidence that undermines the prosecution case or support yours, you'd go to the bank with that. You'd often go down to a client and say, look, we're being prosecuted by Treasury Counsel. There's no room to be had here. On one occasion, I was doing Judge Rinder, and I texted a senior Treasury Counsel, and I think there'd been a not guilty verdict in a well-known case, and I'd said, I'm sorry you lost your case. And this is a guy who, is extremely sort of easygoing, and he wrote back, "Whatever do you mean?" He was genuinely hurt in a serious way that I could have implied that he wanted to win the case as opposed to prosecuting the case fairly.
Absolutely.
And it's fair, the Treasury Counsel who are in the room, there is a kind of spiritual complexion to it. They really care about it. And it's true today, just as it was then. And it also applied, by the way, to people who are DPP. And I do think, again, and it's absolutely no shout out to Keir as a person or as a politician, or certainly the Labour Party's manifesto. But I do think it's hard for him to talk about things that don't go to the issues. It feels like it's unfair or not germane to what his opponent is talking about, which makes it very interesting to see him operate in a political arena. And as I say, I mean, given the polls, if they're like, if they do what if the outcome looks like what we all perceive to be the case, it's a long-winded way to say if Labour win, it will be the first time that we ever have a DPP doing that job, and I do think it's interesting.
Absolutely. I was led by him years ago in a case.
Oh, really?
Years and years ago. In fact, 2006. That's a story in its own right. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. A good friend of mine who Mary knows, Tom Little, is one of those Treasury Counsel. And
we started together, Tom.
Extraordinary guy. So my question is about shelter. If anybody else noticed, I certainly noticed, Paul had the latest campaign behind him, Made in Social Housing. A very, very important campaign. Lots of people coming forward, like Suggs from Madness, saying, it was really important to us, the social housing, Made in Social Housing. Yep. Well done, Paul. Good to bring and highlight that. Why did you get involved in shelter? What was it that led you to that?
Well, partly for that reason, actually. Although it wasn't a campaign at the time, my parents and my dad grew up in social housing. One of the nice things about London, actually other parts of the country too, but I'm sitting here in my private house in Islington, but in reaching distance from my window to social housing. It's one of the few kind of, and mostly it is still social housing. That's an interesting thing when you go abroad and you can share that with people. It's sort of unthinkable in other cities, other similar cities. And because I actually started at university working, as it was then called, a homeless kitchen, and having these encounters quite regularly with the unhoused, as I now think is a sort of better way of thinking about people that don't have homes. I'm thinking it's sort of the one thing that you can have a meaningful, you can meaningfully help an individual with. So many of the encounters that I've had with people who are unhoused, you realize that in addition to various issues that person might be experiencing, in many cases, it's one letter or an aspect, let's say, of my connection with that person where I know how best to speak to power. And so what I loved about Shelter and continue to admire is their ongoing advocacy and the space that they provide for people who are often in crisis to become more powerful advocates and to speak to power. And I think that they do that in a very effective way. And, they've changed sort of countless lives as a result. I think that's the thing. That's what, I feel really passionately about. And also because, as we were talking about before, one of the things, the barometer of, how great we are as a nation, as a city, as a community is how we treat our unhoused, how many we have. As one of the Shelter campaigns at the moment is you can go online and check in your area how many people don't have homes. And you'd be surprised, not just a London phenomenon, as you guys will know only too well. It's across the nation. And it's the one thing that actually with you guys and with politicians across the board, everybody cares about and can actually do something about. So that's why I suppose I got in touch. I ended up making that connection with Shelter. But above all else, it was the skills that I had as an advocate to do very, very small things for individuals that could radically change the outcome of their lives.
Thank you very much indeed.
And lastly, I'm really following on from that, Rob. Another thing I found out on my research this afternoon is there's a campaign, Rob Rinder for PM. Now, you probably missed the boat, but I'm afraid to bring it to you for the 4th of July. But how about it? Do you think you ever moved into public life? Mayor of London, perhaps?
Well, I'm going to leave the politics to you, Lord Banner, I think.
I don't have a nice ring to it.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, I think it's really interesting asking planning lawyers that question, genuinely, because I think that of, all the lawyers that really do interface with politics, local, national, etc., you, as a community, probably do that most. And even in kind of public law, you're either defending or attacking a specific government department, but you're not thinking about kind of politics in the round, sort of big P and small p issues, political issues. But I just think, the question I had earlier about sort of waking up in the morning and the universe being curated by angry Twitter, you think about people close to you in politics and other people that we know, and it's not a happy place to exist. And until the kind of environment, whether it does, becomes a space that captures those of your community and beyond that are the most talented, the most thirsty, and the people that actually want to make a change, I'm just not sure I or anybody else is going to be attracted to it, which is a tragedy, really, because I don't think it's unfair to say. I mean, anybody who disbelieves what I'm about to say, watch my interview with the Children's Minister last week on Good Morning Britain. A dearth of really great talent. And the government, we as a country kind of deserve better.
Yeah, amen. Well, don't put it out. I'll work on you. I'll work on that. I think you'd be great. Rob, you have been great today. Thank you so much.
It's like,
Carry on going. Everyone's stuck around for the 2 hours, but I think I'll get divorced if I do.
it's been fun.
So much indeed. Keep in touch. We'll see you soon, hopefully in person, and come back on for the 200.
I'm here for the 200. Thank you all.
Take care. Viewers, thank you so much for watching today and indeed for all the episodes previously. We really do appreciate it. We're back for one more episode before the summer on the 27th with Professor Samir Bregan. We're looking forward to hearing from him and what he has to say. In the meantime, say good night. Please don't forget the charity donation. Thank you once again to Rob, and happy 100th,